Hello and welcome to Bunker 21. We have a disclaimer, so we're stupid and we're going to talk about things with our opinions. So thanks for listening. The topic for this podcast is about white privilege. It came from a conversation that we were all having randomly outside of this, and we realized it would actually make a good episode. So we're going to talk about white privilege, and the main question is whether white privilege is mislabeled. I don't know. How do you guys want to start? I guess.
Not only whether or not white privilege is mislabeled, but whether or not it would be beneficial to know which labels to use and which labels not to use and what approaches to take in different situations, depending on who you're talking to about these issues.
Absolutely. I think we should go for, that's a really good point. We should probably go for introductions right again. So I'm Kane. That's my name. That's the name I chose. I'm Kane.
I'm Jay.
Yeah. Uh-huh.
I'm Johnny.
I'm Yami.
And I'm Abel.
If you're wondering why there were so many awkward pauses, is because there's no way to point at any person because we're doing this online. So it was just sort of waiting for people to say things.
It's kind of like a group presentation,
Yeah.
honestly.
Oh God, it's actually way more awkward too. But yeah, is white privilege mislabeled? What are sort of first thinking thoughts of it? Like, I'm gonna say yes. I think it is mislabeled, but Jay, what do you think?
Okay, kind of put me on the spot there. I think, well, when it comes to being mislabeled, I think that when it's said, it could be labeled better. That's what I would rather say, because when white privilege, I think, is just heard, it immediately causes a sense of defensiveness, to which a white person would automatically be like, no, I experience suffering, I experience struggles and hardship, and I've fought to, come where I've come. And when you say that to a poor white person, it's very difficult for that person to understand what they don't have to deal with the labeling of white privilege. So I think it's better and more productive to say to talk about the penalty the people of color have to pay and suffer in this country. What do you think, Abel?
I agree with you. I agree with you in the sense that before I decide my stance on whether or not I think that white privilege is mislabeled, I just want to say that I agree with you in the sense that just the term white privilege, when someone says, oh, you have white privilege, it's kind of like, as a white person, I feel like the reason why some of them...
You're not a white person.
I feel like, I know, but what I'm saying is, I feel like white people, right? Like, I feel like white people, when you say, oh, like, when you mention white privilege, they feel like Jay said, it takes away from the hard work that they put in to get to where they are. Not everyone has inherited certain resources, but but at the same time, there's also a bunch of stuff just going back in history where people have benefited due to their whiteness, but that's a different story. I just think it's important to note that when someone mentions white privilege or affirmative action, these things evoke a sense of defensiveness because people don't want to admit that they might have gotten a leg up in certain instances because it takes away from the hard work that they feel like they put in to get to where they need to be. And I feel like for some people that may be more on the defensive side or sensitive, it would be best to approach this situation and say something that is a label that's less attacking in a way.
I feel like that's a somewhat controversial statement, considering that it seems like a lot of people, and I guess a lot of people of color would actually disagree with that. A lot of them feel like that we need to attack white people, that white people are the devil, you know. And what do you think about that? The fact that you're basically saying that you're basically saying to show a sense of empathy towards white people, which is something that some people might not be a fan of in this day and age.
Listen. I'm not saying that you have to be empathetic towards white people because
Oh wow.
what I'm saying,
What? Wait, what's wrong with that?
okay. What I'm saying,
What?
Elaborate, Abel.
what I'm saying is that, at the end of the day, what you're trying to do is you're trying to convince people for your cause. I feel like sometimes with sensitive people, what you have to do is you have to think of the right terminology to use. Instead of talking about white privilege, you could talk about racism and then why people of color are at a disadvantage. And if you explain, like, it's basically a fact, like if you start from that end of the spectrum and you say, oh, I'm at a disadvantage because I'm a person of color, you're more likely to get someone to agree with you if they're sensitive on these issues than if you just say, oh, you benefit from white privilege, so like this and this and that, Like it's more, yes, the white privilege is more direct, and I do think that that's needed in some cases, but I also think that depending on who you're talking to, this could be another method of approaching it. That's what I'm arguing.
Johnny, what do you think about this?
I don't know. That's where I'm going to start at.
Yeah.
I don't know. Thank you for displaying.
Well, when it comes to white privilege, do you think that it's mislabeled? First of all, just to go back to the question.
I really don't know.
You think it's real?
It's a thing that exists. Yes, I think it's more so it's more so an amalgamation of the disadvantages that people of color face. But I think even if you do frame it another way, I'm not sure if it will help. Like, there's something to be said about people just as Abel was saying, there are people who don't want to acknowledge their advantages. And I'm not sure if by labeling it a different way, it really changes that narrative. I think part of it is like, it comes down to like protesting against the flag with, or not against the flag, but against police brutality by kneeling for the American flag or the national anthem. I think that received a lot of criticism because it could, and because it wasn't because like it wasn't a bad. I don't think it was the best idea to begin with. But the thing is, I think it received a lot more hate because it was effective. Like, it got people talking, and people didn't like it because it disrespected the flag, but also made people confront like an advantage that they didn't want to confront. Like, what other way are you going to protest that? Well,
so you think the
as an individual
nature...
person, like as an individual person, because it was an effective protest, people didn't want. I think it contributed to the hate it received, is because it was very visible.
Huh. So you think the provocative nature of the statement itself allows it to be effective?
Yeah, but I really don't know. I don't know if by changing the statement you'll really get anything better out of it.
I think that the label white privilege, I think that we should keep the label, but keep in mind that there are other ways of approaching it. Instead of directly saying white privilege, you could start by saying people of color are at a disadvantage. And that implies that white people are at an advantage without explicitly saying it. And I think that you could get more people on board with that. For me, what I'm thinking about is trying to get as many people to agree with your ideas as possible, trying to get, sometimes it's good discomfort is good, but at the same time, if you're trying to pass certain things, you might not want to turn everyone away. And I feel like the provocative nature of certain protests are good, but I don't know if being provocative 100% of the time is always going to be effective.
Kane, what do you think?
I feel like just sort of in reference to what Johnny and Abel have been talking about, I kind of like, yeah, white privilege exists, and I think it's definitely been shown, like statistically and sort of anecdotally, that white people have an easier time getting through certain situations. And obviously what's going on at the time of when we're recording this, that's definitely true. So I get the point where you guys are coming from when you're saying that let's label this as white privilege or keep that as a label. The only issue I see is that whenever the conversation is about white privilege, it always boils down to like a white person gets confronted with like white privilege exists. And then a white person's like, but I'm not privileged and I'm white. And then the conversation, then I'm starting to realize that like, it's not really about the white person, you know, like white privilege has never been about the white person. It's always just been about how hard life is for other, not even how hard life is, but just the obstacles that other minority, like people of color, like those groups have to face when compared to white people. And that difference, I think, doesn't get explained as much because number one, it's like nuanced, and number two, it's just like, it's not something that you're gonna like dig deeper into. Like you have to first like put aside your own importance. I think calling it something else and putting the sort of onus on it, of it on like the people of color, not the onus, but like the focus of it on the people of color and the groups of color rather than like white people would make the conversation at least a little richer and a little more intelligent. And instead of saying like, if you're white, life is easier for you and you know, don't deserve any of this, it would be instead of like, if you're Black or if you're Hispanic, then life is harder for you.
I think part of it, though, I think, yeah, you're touching up on something that I think that's very important to the issue. And the problem isn't the privilege. I think the problem is that not everyone's receiving it. It's not the fact that it's easier for white people to find success / monetary success, or there's a lot of like advantages that white people have, or a lot of disadvantages that people of color have in America. I think the issue is bringing those advantages to everyone, or it's about eliminating the disadvantages.
But it's not those advantages though, I think, right? Like it's not the monetary, like visible ones. It's like it's like what happened to George Floyd, right?
But yes, yeah. But it's not about like getting rid of the privilege. It's about making that privilege universal. It's not about like, it's not like we should kill white people as much as, it's not like the police should kill white people in an equal amount to Black people by increasing the amount of white people the police kills.
Yeah.
It's about decreasing the amount of Black people the police kill. So
Can I say something about that?
Yeah.
Because you guys have made some very good points, and I'm listening to this, and the one thing that, and I think it was Kane who made a very good point about when you tell certain white people that white privilege exists and they don't get it. That the sort of doc went across my head where it was like, if a white person doesn't understand that they have this so-called white privilege, the tendency that I see people doing is to shove it down their throat even further. And people get defensive about that. Because the issue is, the way that people tell people they have white privilege is not very peaceful at all. It's
No.
very antagonistic. It's very finger pointing. You have white privilege. Don't ever like you have white privilege. Admit that you have white privilege. It's almost basically it almost feels like you're blaming them for it. And quite honestly, I don't think that's right. I don't think so.
Thing
If
is,
a
it
person
makes it
that-
seem like the privilege is the bad thing, when the privilege isn't the bad thing. It's the lack of everyone having said privilege. That's the real bad
The
thing.
lack of equality.
I agree. But if a person doesn't understand, what good does it do to shove it down their throat even further? You're the moment that you do that, in my opinion, you've lost them because they're not going to listen to you. They're going
You're
to
not
get
going to
defensive.
shame anyone into being less racist
Exactly.
or anything.
You're not going to
Yeah.
shame. You're not going to shame anybody into believing that. And bless the
Yeah.
people. Bless those people who already are aware of the fact that they have white privilege, or they have
Yes.
this inherent advantage, or so what, or they don't have this
Yes.
penalty that other people of color have. But unfortunately, there are people who don't understand, and I feel like it is the responsibility, or the people who feel a certain way about this, who aren't white, they should look at this. They should really look inwards and say, "Hey, I should at least approach this topic a little bit more sensitively, because this person is not going to understand if I just shove it in their throat."
And
Yeah,
that's-
you know,
Absolutely.
Yami, I'm actually really glad that you brought that up because that touches on something that I've been thinking about for a while, which is the rhetoric in how we communicate with one another, right? It just seems like in the current political climate, things are so hostile. Like
It is.
everyone's focused on trying to be right. Everyone's focused on like having a debate rather than a dialogue. Like where is that going to get us? It's just this is what's going to happen in my opinion. Like one person is just going to become more entrenched in their opinions, the other person is going to become more entrenched in their opinions and get defensive, and people are going to start looking for whatever they can in the narratives that they've constructed for themselves. And it's news organizations like Fox News, maybe even and CNN, that allow people to create those narratives. I'm not necessarily saying that one political spectrum is wrong, but I'm just saying that when we let ourselves focus on the narrative instead of the facts as a whole, that's when we let ourselves be swayed easier. And
Yes.
that kind of goes.
Sorry.
Yeah, what are you saying?
No, I'm saying that like when it comes to these situations, the whole point of this is to sort of allow someone to think for themselves. Because if a person says I don't believe that I have any, if a white person says I don't believe I have any privilege, it's perfectly fine to be angry about that. It's perfectly fine to feel a certain way about it. My thing is, don't lash out. Simply ask why. Why do you believe that?
It's not even,
Yeah.
I don't even know if it's perfectly fine to be angry. Like I agree with what you're saying, but it's like I mean, there's so many sort of factors in why people respond the way they do. And sometimes I think genuine feeling and genuine thinking is like maybe 2% of that response. And like all the other stuff is just like, like whatever everyone else is thinking, and like what is this sort of feeling that you normally have to have. Like I don't know if we're going to talk about cancel culture or not, but like that kind of stuff is propelled by like a very small group of people, and it's incredibly programmatic, and it's the exact same thing over and over. But like shame and all of those kind of like negative accusatory kind of actions, they never bring about good things. You can't shame someone into liking you. You can't shame someone into understanding that they come from a privileged background. You can't shame someone into nuance, because white privilege, it's not as simple as just like, a white person has like, oh my God, when I go to the bank and I say that like, hey, did you know I'm white? I get like $5 extra. That's not it. It's not a monetary thing. It's not a height thing. It's not anything you can see or measure. It's more of like, it's the thing of like George Floyd. It's like Ahmaud Arbery. It's like a bunch of cases. It's like things like that. And like, being profiled. And it's invisible things sometimes. It's stereotypes.
Right.
Like when you're white in this country, you don't have a stereotype that's put on you. But when you're black or when you're Hispanic or when you're Asian or when you're whatever, you you do. You have already sort of a profile written up about you in a person's head. And that's for a lot of reasons that are not necessarily the fault of white people as a whole, right? It's like there are too many white people to stereotype them. It's just too many of them. So you can't go like, oh, all white people are like this. Because it's like, no, because there are white people that are not like this. There are white people that are like this. And it's just, it's insane. So I think that like, sorry, yeah.
I'm sorry. I think another part of the issue is that like not all white people really get to see white privilege or the color panel. Like rural America is very white in many areas, or very segregated. Right, I shouldn't even say very white, but very, very monochromatic, if you will. Like
not even monochromatic, just white, bro. Monochromatic means it's like black and white. It's just white.
No. But like
just one color.
But
I thought mono was.
But what I'm really saying is like
you took Latin.
Mono is one color, bro.
Mono is one, yes. It's
it's
one color. But
what
I mean by this is that like,
oh my bad.
In rural America, there are small communities. Communities tend to be very small and tend to be only of one race, whatever race that is. It tends to be white people or black people, but mostly white people, but still also black people. But those people don't feel the effects of the institution. The institutions don't exist there in most of rural America. Like crime is pretty much non-existent in these areas. So like the police don't really do anything but give out speeding tickets. Like a big part of this issue is that a lot of the people that need convincing never actually see what's happening. Like, and if they're disadvantaged because rural America tends to be less affluent than urban America, a term like white privilege makes it seem like they do have an advantage when they really don't. They really don't see that advantage whatsoever.
I mean, I'm just going to cut in with a couple of ideas that I've had as you guys have been speaking. So
go ahead, Abel.
In terms of Yami, I just want to say that that's, I agree with you 100%. I feel like by shaming someone, it's less likely for you to convert them to your side if you take an aggressive approach. But I also think it's important to know that as a person of color, seeing these, going through these issues every single day, seeing this, to me, it's like, and to other people of color, it can be as clear as day. And to have someone say that it doesn't exist, it could get very emotional very quickly, because sometimes you can cite facts, you can cite personal experiences, but there are always going to be those people that don't listen. And so I can see why people tend to get aggressive, and sometimes that's okay. It's okay to be emotional, but at the same time, if you want to convert people to your cause, approaching the narrative from a different side would be beneficial. Approaching it from the side of, because I'm a person of color, I'm at a disadvantage. It implies that you as a white person are at an advantage without explicitly saying it. And then it's moving the conversation towards being more towards equality, towards equity.
But how though? Maybe it's just me, but if someone told me that, if I was a white person and someone told me, if you said I'm a person of color, and what did you say?
I said, okay, so for example, like, let's say you're a white person, right? Let's say you're a white person that straight up from the rural areas, right? You just don't really have an understanding of how systemic racism persists to this day. What you would have to, in terms of approaching a person like that, you could approach it and say, oh, like, you benefit from white privilege because of this and this and that. But but again, these people might not see the effects of it or realize the effects of it. I still do think that they benefit from white privilege in a certain way, but that's it. I think white privilege is a spectrum. I think that I think in certain cases, there are people that have benefited more from white privilege. For example, people that have been in the United States for long periods of time that have had benefits, not even just plantation owners, but also people that have benefited from the GI Bill and the federal Housing Act, just stuff that benefited white middle-class Americans and spared African Americans from those benefits. So I do think there's a spectrum to white privilege, but that's a different story. In terms of how you would want to approach this, you could approach it by talking about all of the facts, explaining how systemic racism persists to this day, showing articles most people are reasonable, are rational people, I think. So if you educate them and you approach it from that lens, and then you say, I'm at a disadvantage, you might be able to get them to agree that things need to change from that lens. You know, things need to change because you need to help me because I'm at a disadvantage because of my race. I think that it could be beneficial to approach it from that way instead of saying, oh, like you benefit from white privilege, et cetera, and then this needs to change because it could, like you said, it could be shaming them. So I think it's another way of doing it that, you know, everyone's going to have their own method of doing things. I just think that this one is less, it pushes people antagonistic.
Antagonistic, yeah.
Oh, okay. Wait. Oh, sorry. Did I cut
But
you off?
everyone has their own method of doing things. It's what do you want to decide? Because at the end of the day, like by you being taking a more passive approach, it does take away from I would say the seriousness of the issue by you being a little bit more passive. But at the same time, if you're trying to get people to agree with you and you're trying to get things passed, sometimes you have to be a little more passive and understanding that, you know, you're going to have to be a little passive and nice if you want to educate these people, not just shame them into agreeing with you.
Mm-hmm.
Yeah. I agree with that, but I think.
Sorry, I completely disagree that passiveness can sometimes take away. What did you say? Passiveness can take away from making it clear how serious the issue was. I don't know if I necessarily believe that, because by your definition, Martin Luther King Jr.'s peaceful protest,
That wasn't passive.
That wasn't. If you compare it to Malcolm X and what he was trying to advocate for.
No, hold on. We've talked about this before. First of all, there was a point for it to be peaceful. The point was that, like, the reason why you don't riot is so that you don't sympathize with the people that are oppressing you, right? Like, if
Both
you
actions
don't
are
riot,
active.
yeah, and also that, like, you're also marching, and like that is an act in and of itself. It's not a passive thing to do. Passive would have been if Martin Luther King Jr. just sat down and went like, but he didn't. Like, it was a really well thought out, really intellectual thing. Same thing with Gandhi, same thing with Mandela.
So
Maybe passive isn't the right word here.
I don't think
maybe
passive is the right word.
Yeah, wait,
maybe
because
you're saying
yeah.
like the phrasing, the specific phrasing is more passive, like the phrasing of the color penalty rather than using the term white privilege.
It's less direct. Passive. Less direct is a better word for saying.
I wouldn't even say
non-confrontational. I think
it's
the word
less
is
confrontational.
Non-confrontational.
But it is equally as direct. You're just focusing on different things. Because white privilege focuses on, you're saying the same thing, and you're saying both directly. They're both very clearly saying what they mean. In my mind.
So it's double speak.
Yeah.
Okay. Well,
it's not. No. Hold on.
Come on! You can't even.
It's not double. No, because double speak has a very implied negative connotation, and you're using an.
But that's not what we're trying to say.
No, but that's not the point. The point is, like, Okay, when you call it a color penalty, right? And we all, I don't know if we've all decided on this word, but this is a phrase that I really like way more than white privilege, because the focus is on the people of color. So when you talk about like a color penalty, you're describing the same thing, but you're describing it in a much more focused and sharp way. If you say white privilege, you're dealing with so many things. And you're telling a white person that, hey, you are privileged because you do not face a penalty. You are privileged because you don't go through these obstacles. You're privileged because you don't
Okay.
go through the hardships. Okay, this is it. You are privileged because you don't go through the hardships that a colored person goes through, or that a person of color goes through. Okay? But you're shortening it and saying that instead, color penalty, a person of color goes through hardships. You're simplifying the whole thing. And by simplifying it, you're making it more direct and more focused. And you're shifting the conversation to, how do we lift people of color up from whatever they're being oppressed, instead of, white people, you suck. White people, no. Like, that's never going to be a productive conversation. You know, that's it.
I think I wanted to reflect on that a little bit, just because we've been talking about this idea of shaming, and while I agree with the sort of general consensus that we reached that that's not productive, being confrontational in that manner, as to automatically, accuse someone of being wrong before the conversation has even begun. I think that's inherently wrong. But I
Yeah.
think in situations where racism is overt as it is so overt, like we've seen in the George Floyd case, there needs to be criticism. There needs to be that sort of there needs to be a harsh criticism in response to that, because if racism becomes so overt to that level, there needs to be sort of an example that, okay, no, this is not a country that tolerates that. But when it's less overt, when a person is willing to listen, when person's actually willing to have a dialogue and discussion, then I do think definitely we need to be non-confrontational and open about it. But there's a time
Yeah.
there's a time for that, I think.
I
And
agree
there's a
with you,
time to
Jay.
take more ready action.
I agree, Jay. Yeah.
There are some cases where you just have to be super confrontational when it's a blatant act of racism. But if you're
Yep.
trying to educate the everyday person, being confrontational might not be the best way to do it.
Also, I don't think the phrase white
agree with that
privilege,
sentiment.
this is like away from what you're saying, but I don't think the white privilege is sort of always used in like a nuanced kind of way. And I don't think we've ever looked at like a racist person and said, like, they were benefiting from white privilege. So I think you're totally right. I think we've got to, like, this is a weird conversation to have because it's so layered, right? And there's so many different ways to be racist. There's so many different ways to, like, suffer because of because of the skin of your color, because of the color of your skin. Like there can be a rich, a rich African American person and, a poor white person, and you might think like, oh, so if you're rich, you don't have any privilege anymore. That's completely fine. Or if you're rich, you have that privilege. But it's like, that's not true. Like, you'll still get profiled sometimes. You'll still have like you'll still have a higher chance of more negative consequences and everything. So we've got to
Also,
be
if you
really, really, sorry, go ahead.
no, sorry about cutting you off. But also, if you're light skinned but you're in a minority community, it's also a completely different experience as well.
Yes.
Isn't that
Because
colorism?
Color.
That's
it is
colorism.
colorism. It is colorism.
Yeah.
Like you can be a light skinned but still be a minority, or you can be
Yeah.
but you can also be really dark skinned and you could still be called out by your own minority.
Yeah, exactly. It's a thing that
That's the thing.
in the Indian community, I think there's a lot of stuff in African countries where they have
Yes.
similar kind of ideas. It goes to show how, like, fundamentally stupid racism is, because like
Mm.
it just doesn't, if you like, to a racist, two Indians are going to look the exact same, but then within that group of Indian people, they'll like point out the most nuance of things. And so it just doesn't, like, there's no way to end. It just never stops. So it was
Let me
really
let me
stupid.
ask you guys this. Let's say I'm sampling, okay? Let's say we look at a sample in like North Dakota, a small town in North Dakota where every citizen, every person in that town is white. White as snow. White as people, not a single person of color there. Nada, nothing. Does a citizen there experience white privilege?
Johnny, what
Uh,
do you think about that?
I don't.
Can you repeat that?
If you were in a town, a town in rural North Dakota, small town, maybe 300 people. Every single person there, the police, the chef, the restaurant owners, every single person there is white. White. Does this average citizen there experience white privilege in that little bubble? Because according to the dictionary, white privilege are the inherent advantages possessed by a white person on the basis of their race in a society characterized by racial inequality and injustice. And I guess society in this case would have to pertain to that town specifically.
Can I
I
answer
think.
this?
Go
Oh,
ahead.
sorry. Well, I'll just say it's a quick thing of like, in their own town, no, they don't benefit from white privilege, but they don't suffer from a color penalty. And yeah, Abel, go ahead.
I was gonna say that it might be less evident, but so let's put aside all the historical things that would make certain people in that town benefit from their white privilege over the course of decades. Let's put that all aside and assume that they're all recent immigrants or whatever, didn't really benefit from most of the financial stuff that came with being white in America. Now, I still feel like this is probably going to be an unpopular opinion, but I do feel like they still benefit from white privilege in this town. And I feel like one thing that, you know, we haven't really talked about is just the way that people of color are portrayed in the media and stuff like that. People in that town are still getting access to outside sources of information and stuff that could portray people of color in a negative light. If you were to like, so for example, maybe if you're the sheriff in that small town and you see you're like you see a group of kids just like walking around like at like 1 a.m. You probably wouldn't stop them and stuff like that. I still do feel like there are certain instances where they benefit from white privilege in that town.
In what capacity though?
Hey, Abel, I would actually like to follow up on that because I agree with you. I think they benefit from what they don't have to experience. Because when it comes to people of color, you have to worry you have to worry about when you see a cop, for example, right? I would go out of my way to say the average white person doesn't necessarily feel fear. As a kid, when you're a person of color, you probably never feel fear going up because you're told, oh, all cops are going to protect you, all cops are going to do this. But it's a different psychological response.
Well, you do feel fear if you're breaking a law, but that's a different story entirely.
But if you're not breaking a law, even though
if you're just walking around minding your business and you see a cop, you're not worried whatsoever.
Yeah,
exactly.
But even
But
if you're breaking the law, if you're a person of color, that fear is constant. Like you pass by a cop, you just get nervous. At least
also,
for me, like
exactly. Yeah.
You could be doing nothing wrong. You could be walking on the side of the street and you'll still get nervous. But even if, let's say, for example, in this town, like there are instances of people that are white that break the law but aren't penalized as heavy for it. And I do feel like it's because people of color are often portrayed as criminals, even in this town, where I just feel like they do, like Jay said, they do benefit from it.
Yeah.
Based off not going through the experiences.
Exactly.
Okay.
So, yeah,
Okay.
that's the privilege.
Let's say
The
different
privilege is what you
situation.
don't have to
See,
do.
the privilege is the penalty. The privilege is the
Exactly.
lack of penalty. And if someone were to enter that bubble who wasn't white, they would feel the penalty. So therefore, I would argue that yes, there would be white privilege. But I think this goes to show why I think the term color penalty can be better in some scenarios. Because in this
It's way better.
scenario,
It's just way better.
I think in this scenario, the privilege isn't felt, but the penalty would be, or the lack of penalty does exist. Because no matter where you are I'm not speaking from experience on this, but I'm guessing no matter where you are, as a person of color, you feel the penalty. So anywhere where there is a lack of penalty, there is a lack of penalty, or any group that has a lack of penalty is privileged in that sense. Am I making sense here?
No, you're making it
I see what you're saying, but at the same time, there's also, I'll be the first to say that there's so many layers to this that there are so many layers to this that, I don't really know the full grasp of the topic, but I do have a feeling that, like, white privilege would still exist in this town. Like,
oh
just
yeah,
even
I'm not
based off of
disagreeing with you.
Oh, okay.
Yeah,
I'm saying that privilege
Johnny's
does
agreeing.
exist. I'm saying that the privilege does exist, but the privilege, I would say, is a lack of penalty.
But the privilege isn't even okay. It is okay. I get what
For
you're
white
saying.
people,
It's the same thing.
if you're a white person,
Completely agree.
if you're a white person, the privilege is manifested as a lack of, like, you don't have to work. It's the lack of fear when you see a cop. It's the lack of getting checked at an airplane. It's the lack of getting killed by your civil protector.
And I just want to point
It's
out,
not something you're getting. It's
really quickly, I just want to
penalties
point
you're
out,
not receiving.
Yes, I want to point out that what Johnny said was just perfect. It's the lack of it. It's the lack of this, the lack of that, which is exactly why the word privilege is so convoluted when it comes to describing that. Thank you, Johnny.
You would never use privilege to describe any sort of other thing. You wouldn't say like, shoot, I'm stupid. You wouldn't say like, no, never mind. I can't even come up with examples because it's just.
No, it's unnatural. It's unnatural to say, oh, I don't have to mow the lawn today, and I'm so privileged to not have to do that.
You know what? Ricky Gervais has this joke about being an atheist where like, it's like white privilege and atheism are both two concepts that are so weird. Because atheism is like your lack of belief in God, right? But like his joke is that like, if I don't believe in fairies, you don't call me like a fairy, like an anti-fairyist or whatever. It doesn't make any sense. It like, in that same way, you just can't accuse someone of not feeling something that they just can't. Like the point is that you don't suffer from it. And so if you're accusing someone of not realizing that they don't suffer from it, where do we go from here?
I'm not sure.
You're almost making it seem like being a person of color is a disease.
With that being said, I am not a person of color. With that being said, I'm not a person of color, so I wouldn't know if that's entirely the case, if I'm reflecting white privilege well, if that's really the issue at hand.
You can just say that. You can just say you're white, man. You don't have to say I'm not a person of color.
Well, I'm not a person of color. I'm a white person. So, like, me saying that could be incredibly flawed. I could be incredibly wrong with what I'm saying.
So robotic. It was like, I am not a person of color. I am not a person of color. I am a white person.
I am a white person.
But like,
we should title this "Race Unveil."
Race reveal.
Oh my gosh. Do you remember those race reveal parties? Yeah.
Oh yeah, baby.
Well, so we all.
Imagine if someone like wasn't in a relationship and was hooking up with like a person of every race and somehow got pregnant, and they did like a race reveal of the baby.
Bro, that'd be the best Maury episode.
Yo, my man.
Guys,
Oh, for fuck's sake! I'm gonna have to edit this again.
Abel,
So for those of you wondering why you just heard a bleep, Johnny Boy here just revealed Abel's real name. It's okay. It's common.
Abel, am
among
I missing something
classes.
though? Am I missing something there? Is there more to white privilege than the lack of a
I think
penalty?
it's the way you
Or-
look at it, because the lack
I
of
think
penalty.
those things are equivalent.
Yeah, lack of penalty, like lack of penalty in the sense that, for example, the penalty of being a person of color. Sometimes if your name is too ethnic, they throw away your job application. But if you could look at it as a color penalty, or on one way you could look at it as white privilege, because you have a privilege of getting your name read off a stack of resumes.
That's
Now,
true.
But it's
the way of looking at it could shift. Your way of talking about it could shift based off of how you want to approach the narrative with a specific person. Either approach it from it being a color penalty, or it being a way that a certain group of people benefit over another group of people.
I feel like color
Generally,
penalty
it's the
is,
privilege of not versus the penalty of.
But
Right?
like
No, but
color
it-
penalty just allows it to be focused on the plight of people of color. Like in the case of job applications, it's like,
It's
yes, it's true that if you're privileged that you get your name read off and everything, but it's
if
just
your name
that,
is if your name is Johnny,
that's your name.
you have the privilege of not getting your name thrown out.
Yeah.
Versus
Right.
if your name is
Young
I'm
Sue.
not gonna go
Like
Young
if your
Sue.
name was like
young Sue.
Sue.
Soo Young.
If your name is Sunwon,
Someone.
What are you talking about?
which is a pretty common Korean name if I remember correctly.
It's not, but
No,
go on.
Sungwon?
it's not, but go on.
Well,
That's why I
Sounds
said-
close
that's-
enough. Sounds close
That's
enough,
why,
right?
that's why I said Soo Young, you dumbass. I offered you an out. I offered you an
Johnny's
out, my
just sitting
man.
here going like just making up
Okay.
names, going like
Oh,
I'm
your
gonna say
name like
is that
Kumquat.
I have
offered
two
you
kumquat.
I have two Korean friends who are both named Sungwon. So
They're two.
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 And I don't
Dude,
know
that's it.
and I don't know any. I
I'm
don't know
offering you an
any-
out. I'm
Okay.
offering you an out. You didn't take it.
Congratulations.
White privilege is maybe knowing two Korean people and assuming I know all the Korean people.
I'm not saying I know all the Korean people, but I'm figuring if I know like 20 Koreans total and two of them have the same
Shut up,
name,
John. Shut up, Johnny.
it's probably a
You
pretty
probably
common
know all
name.
of them, right?
Shut
Yeah,
up, Johnny.
of course.
No,
of
no,
course,
it's
of
probably a
course.
pretty common name. But
But I'm not going to
Okay,
assume like
that's
every
wrong.
white person's named Johnny, right? Like, how does that reasoning work?
no,
Like,
but
it just doesn't-
how many mics do you know?
Papa John's.
Like a couple.
You know a
What?
couple mics? Actually,
Yeah.
I shouldn't make this argument. But like
Why would you use? Don't use a white name.
generally
There are white
generally the
people
more
everywhere.
generally the more people you know that have a certain name, the more common that name is. That was the logic I was going with. So I'm sorry. But that is a name I know that is Korean that I'm not going to say numerous amount, but a substantial portion of Korean friends have.
Dude, two.
Two.
How
Two,
many
that's
Korean
it.
friends do you have?
Dude, that's two.
Like 3.
What? You fucking.
Oh my god, you guys.
That's it. Oh, and you heard the beep. That's because he said my fucking name, bro.
Okay, so
I'm
I
just-
think
I'm
right
just-
now
I'm
we've
just
got a
delete that.
format. So every episode, it's always going to be one person who can't dig themselves out of a hole. It's always going to be.
Wait.
this-
Let me
this-
let me end it up. Let me end it up.
No,
let me wrap
we
this up.
haven't. Wait, I just want to say seriously that like we've all come to a consensus that I think it is sort of mislabeled, right? I think we kind of all agree that like just the attitude towards white privilege is just a little like misconfigured. But is there some sort of solution? Like, should we start using the term color penalty? Like, what do you guys think?
Yes. Okay, I'm gonna start.
I think
off.
yes
Okay,
and
then
maybe.
go ahead.
I'm saying yes in some situations, but in other situations,
When would you use white
Not
privilege?
fruitful. Like when you're talking about it with normal people who, like, because white privilege is still an established term, you know?
But why can't we change it?
Let's change it. I'm
Because
saying
we're
that
like-
let's say you could
there's
change
no
We're
it.
gonna be like
obligation.
the two
There's no-
people who use the term color penalty.
Then
It
let's
takes
change
time to
it.
catch
you just
on.
need
Let's-
two Koreans to
Right.
establish a trend of Korean names.
Oh
It's
my
like,
god,
Right.
Sung
We're
Wong,
gonna establish-
Sung Wong. Oh my
we're
god.
gonna
Oh my
establish a
God.
trend.
Yeah, bro. You're just digging yourself a hole here, my man. Stop
No,
it.
Johnny,
Stop
it's,
it.
Johnny, what I mean
Stop.
is that like if you could choose
His
between
face.
both and they were both and they were both completely established, right? Which phrase would you use? Like there's no problem of like, like it's weird to use one, it's weird to use the other. If both color penalty and white privilege were established, which would you use?
Okay, so I'm just gonna go
Johnny?
ahead and okay, Johnny.
I asked Johnny a question and he's not responding.
And just end the podcast. I'm done.
Johnny.
I'm done. I'm done. I'm done.
All right, can I go ahead and
Yes,
give my
please.
thoughts?
Stop.
Yes,
All right,
please.
guys.
Go ahead.
So I think that when it comes to white privilege versus color penalty, why are you guys laughing? What's so funny about this, guys?
Because I was trying to talk to Johnny.
Okay,
And
Okay.
now
so racial injustice is funny to you guys. I'm glad to see.
Here's what I'm gonna
Such an
say.
entertaining concept.
Oh, please. Please.
Here's what I'm gonna
Oh,
say.
Oh my god.
Oh,
Can
please.
you guys
my
let
God.
Jay speak?
no, Johnny has to first answer. I'm
Let
sorry,
me say
Jay.
this.
Fine.
This
Stop
name
interrupting,
has a Wikipedia page, so it's clearly used.
man.
Are you
my
still
God.
on this?
He's so
Sung Woo thing?
He's
It's a
such
clearly
That's
used
amazing.
name. Okay,
That's amazing.
it is a name that is used.
Johnny.
It is a name that
Johnny.
exists.
Johnny.
Don't
Johnny,
throw
All
me
right,
under the
for the
bus
viewers
here.
that are
Johnny,
confused
I
right now,
asked you a
Johnny's going into
question.
Korean history
Johnny,
to
I
find
asked you a
validation
question.
that Sungwoong is a
Johnny,
real name.
What's
I
your
asked you a
question?
question that was fundamental to this episode, and you've been spending this entire time proving that you're not racist. Which is like if you have to look up
Wait, what was the
whole
question? What,
thing.
what was the question? What was the question? What was the question? Repeat the question.
So we
Oh
have
my
a sex
God.
offender and a racist on our channel. That's great.
Wait, what was the
No,
question? I'm serious. What was the question?
Okay, the question was that if both color penalty and white privilege were established terms, which would you use?
Color penalty.
Okay, that's all my question. That's all. Yeah, that's all I was looking for.
Okay,
So let's
I've been
start using that
interrupted.
term.
Okay, so
I'm so sorry,
please,
Jay.
please
So
let me
sorry.
fucking.
You just said my
Okay.
real name. Fuck you.
I have to bleep it out again. Oh my god.
If you just heard a bleep, it's because Jay just made an oopsie. Now, Jay, could you go
Oh.
on with your points?
Damn. Okay. Yes. So to respond to Kane's question about white privilege versus color penalty, I think that both terms can be used, and I think the term privilege can be used when it comes to use your privilege. I think that phrase has a place in the current day context of politics in this country, as it's still a tangible thing. The color penalty can be used when communicating the existence of white privilege, because if we can pretty much connect how, like, what's the best analogy for this? 3 times 5 is the same as 5 times 3, which is how I view, because
Is that
they're both
proven?
15. No.
Yes.
Yeah,
No,
they're
you're
both
right,
equal to
I'm
the
sorry.
same thing, right? Which is
Yes.
representative how the color penalty is the same thing as white privilege. If we can use that rhetoric in convincing people that this disadvantage does exist for people of color in this country, then that's where that term is going to be the most beneficial. But as of right now, white privilege is something that can be used for those that do understand, and to actually use that sort of benefit that they have in relation
Right.
to the disadvantage.
Cool.
Pretty
Cool.
convoluted.
All right, beautiful ladies and gents. Thanks for listening to another.
Wait. Before we end up, I just want to say
disclaimer.
no thanks to our sponsors.
Okay then.
Okay, thanks to our sponsors today. We're sponsored by Tigers. Now, have you ever wanted to hurt someone but not take responsibility? Tigers. Thank you. Okay, so now you go ahead and.
I'd like to also add.
No, please don't. Please
What is
don't.
it?
Please don't. Please
Wait,
don't.
our new sponsor, Sungwon. Sungwon. Have you ever-
Okay. For real. I need to. I'm gonna be serious about this. For those of you that have stuck to this video for some fucking reason, problematic
53
reasons.
minutes and counting.
Yeah.
Is that true?
I just want to say that we're here to learn, and at the end of the day, we don't claim to be experts on any issue. And the opinions that we state are just substantiated by the evidence that we've seen and the experiences that we've had.
It's entirely
And-
anecdotal.
Maybe for you, Johnny, but but honestly, feel free to comment below, and we'll take that to heart. After all, we're here to educate ourselves, and we're hoping that you guys can help us along that process.
I don't
We're
see
here to
us
learn at the
bringing
end of the
in
day,
any actual
and
statistics
I hope I can
or
speak
any
for every one of us
actual-
except Johnny.
Oh my
To the
god.
entire
with-
nation of South Korea.
And
We're
with
so
that,
sorry.
and with that,
Can you stop
Thank-
trying to silence Jade?
and with that, ladies and gentlemen, thank you for listening to the podcast. And
Yes.
have a great rest of your day.